All right, so we are going to be doing for Monday our last reading that is not either The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, right? So you're going to be looking at, on fairy stories, Tolkien's essay on fairy tale and fantasy. You will find it in a book called The Tolkien Reader. There are other books available that have that essay in it, but they are either British publications not available in the U.S. or are more expensive than this one. So I went with this. There's a lot of other kind of cool, interesting little stuff in here. There's a novella called Farmer Giles of Ham that's unrelated to the Middle Earth stuff, but is actually, kind of cool and fun and similar in spirit to The Hobbit. But before we get started, do you guys have any questions about the paper or the exam?
For the paper, do we have, with our response papers, do we have to put our quote at the very top?
No, because you're going to be using more than one quote, right?
Okay.
So yeah, you'll just work that into the body of the paper. Any other questions about the paper or the exam?
And for this class as well, you're going to get the blue books.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's only two, so if they really are only a penny, then 2 cents,
Yeah.
But then like if I get them myself, then it's not a big deal if somebody forgot or whatever. So it's So that is what we will do. I have also given you guys a set of sample questions for the midterm. So I haven't put on the sample questions specific texts that you will be asked to reference on the exam, but I think through reading the questions you can look through and see which texts are appropriate for each question, right? Which will help you guess at which ones you'll actually be asked about. Remember that all of the questions are going to be comparative. They're going to ask you to compare two texts to each other, right? Usually one text will be required by the question, and another will be your choice. And your exam responses should be about 500 words long. So just keep a count as you're going, right? Now, in terms of the identifications for the exam, right? So think about terms that we've discussed in class, right? So any particular things that have popped up in multiple sessions. So things like Reka, things like the mead hall and its significance. Things like this concept of Offermode, right? Conceptual stuff like this is what's likely going to pop up most. Though there will also probably be some questions about, say, specific characters or locations, right? And I think you both know the drill here, right? What this is going to look like. But just a reminder, I want a brief definition. I want the text to which the term is most relevant, and the author of that text. Because we're still dealing, in this half of the course, with authors who aren't Tolkien. This will be a little bit less relevant in the second half of the course, where everything is written by the same guy. Right. So, any other questions about upcoming assignments? All right, great. So let's get into the Children of Hurin. Now, I want to start with something we didn't really get a chance to talk about last time. I want to talk a little bit about the origins of this text and what exactly it is that we're looking at here in terms of Tolkien's body of work. So, like The Fall of Gondolin, this was a story that Tolkien began circa 1917 while he was convalescing in hospital from trench fever. So yeah, it was a product of his convalescence leave, but the version of the story that he wrote and didn't finish in 1917 is in many ways quite different from what we have here. For one thing, it was in verse, as was the original version of the Fall of Gondolin, right? So he started out trying to write these alliterative epic poems. Right, in a mode not unlike Beowulf or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So we're dealing with these long alliterative romances in verse. But by the 1920s, these had been abandoned. And he started reworking these tales in prose. So by 1937, he's well into his Silmarillion mythology, and a version of this story appears in this early version of the Quintus Silmarillion, or History of the Silmarils. But this is a story that he keeps tinkering with and that he keeps coming back to. So the version that we have in this book dates mostly from about 1959. So he kept working on this after The Lord of the Rings was completed and published. It seems like he always held out some hope that these mythological great tales of the First Age would see publication, though in his lifetime they did not. So for a while, the only version of this that was available was an edited version of the 1937 Quintus Silmarillion story, which appears in the book now simply known as the Silmarillion, compiled by his son Christopher and the Canadian fantasy writer Guy Gabriel Kay. Then in 1980, Christopher Tolkien puts out another book called Unfinished Tales, which includes a text called Narn Ihin Hurin, which in Elvish, and Sindarin specifically, means the lay of the children of Hurin. And the version that appears in the 1980 book is genuinely unfinished. There are parts where there are gaps in the narrative that Christopher Tolkien fills in, right, with commentary, and that mostly is taken from the 1959 version. What we have here is an attempt to synthesize by Christopher Tolkien the 1959 Children of Hurin with the 1937 Silmarillion version, and thus create a kind of definitive version of this tale, right? So in its attempt to sort of meld some of these early versions together in order to fill in the gaps that were left in some. So with a lot of these First Age great tales, there is some debate over how much of this is genuinely J.R.R. Tolkien and how much of it is Christopher Tolkien's editorial interventions. But I think, the overall outline of the story is largely as J.R.R. Tolkien intended it to be, though he never quite completed it. So what I'd like to talk about a little bit is influences here. because we didn't get into too much of that last time. So what direct influences did you guys notice based on stuff that we had already read in this course? Were there things that seem to speak directly to stuff we've read before?
Rekka.
What's that?
Rekka.
Okay, yeah, the whole Rekka theme, right? Yeah. Right, from the wanderer and the seafarer. Since Turin seems to spend much of his life in exile, given that every place he goes to seems to get destroyed.
The idea of weird, as in the idea of fate,
Okay.
and doom, not meaning doom, but meaning fate.
Okay, yeah, this notion of weird that we get out of Anglo-Saxon poetry as well, yeah. Can you give me an example from the second half of this of where we see this weird taking its effect?
The way when Hurin comes across the dragon Gondolin,
Uh-huh.
he tells him, if you abandon Gondolin, you're sealing your fate.
Uh-huh.
But if you go and help her, you have a chance of escaping it.
Uh-huh.
He has this opportunity to avoid the curse, avoid the fate, and he still chooses.
Yep. And yeah, and then that raises the question, as any of these narratives that are driven in some way by fate are, right? Okay, could he have actually avoided making that choice, right? That's there are echoes here in some cases of the ancient Greek tragedy of Anapis, right? How familiar are you guys with the story of Anapis?
Very.
Okay.
Heard it enough. Essentially, a king was told that his son would kill him.
Uh-huh.
His wife bore a son. He cast him out,
Yep.
thinking he was dead. He was raised by farmers, came back, killed his father, and married the queen without knowing.
Mhm. Yeah. Didn't know. Yeah. Didn't know the man he killed was his father either.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Didn't realize he was adopted.
And married the queen, and then found out it was his mother. And
Uh huh.
did he tear his eyes out?
Yeah. His mother slash wife commits suicide, and he puts out his own eyes. Right. And it's his own pride, his own hubris, right? His own blindness to his own identity that leads to his horrible fate. And I think that Turin is in many ways similar to Oedipus, not just in the incest subplot here, but also in the way he attempts in some ways to master or to avoid his ultimate fate through these shifts in identity, right? So this last name he takes on, Turambar, you guys remember what that meant?
Doom Conqueror or
Yeah, master of
Yeah,
doom,
Master of Doom, yeah. Right, that is one who takes charge of his own fate. But the name ends up being ironic, right? Master of Doom by Doom mastered, right? Eventually, he succumbs to Morgoth's curse, just as it was always clear he was going to. Now, we also see here some elements from the Saga of the Volsungs, right? How is the dragon Glarum characterized? What's Glarum like?
massive.
Okay, yeah, he's massive,
Greedy,
right?
he
Yeah,
takes over-
greedy.
I can't pronounce that.
He takes over Nargothrond, yeah.
And instead of, going out and continuing destroying everything, he gathers all the treasure and sleeps.
Yeah.
And destroys the bridge.
Yeah. So he's like Fafnir, right? In that he gathers a horde. And he's also like Fafnir in that he converses with the hero, right? Now, if we think also about the way Turin eventually kills Glorm, what does he have to do?
Stab him on his underbelly.
Yeah, he's got to. He and Hunthor get into that ravine, right? And they wait for Glorm to come by, and they stab upwards, right? So the way Glorm is killed is also very reminiscent of Sigurd's defeat of Fafnir.
Except the blood gets on him.
Yeah, he does get the blood on him, yes. And it knocks him out. But he also learns important truths from Glorm as well, right? Even though they're not truths that he wants to know. Like, Glorm does lie to him, but there's always a kernel of truth in Glorm's lies. And indeed, like, the last thing that Glorm says before his death to Nienor, on page 243, "Hail, Nienor, daughter of Hurin. We meet again ere we end. I give you joy that you have found your brother at last. And now you shall know him, a stabber in the dark, treacherous to foes, faithless to friends, and a curse unto his kin, Turin, son of Hurin. But the worst of all his deeds you shall feel in yourself." Glorm's not lying here, right? This is all true. This is all absolutely true. And it also calls to mind the incestuous relationship of Sigmund and Signy in the Volsung saga, right? Although Sigmund and Signy knew full well what they were doing and that it was consensual, right? And in this case, Tolkien has made the whole thing a little bit more forgivable to modern sensibilities by giving Nienor amnesia. And also, given that like brother and sister have never actually met, right? In fact, there seems to be a great deal of contrivance here to make sure that from the age of 9, Turin never sees any of his relatives. Right? Largely in order to preserve this little secret. There is another influence on this text that we did not look at that I would like to discuss a little bit. So one of the texts that interested Tolkien most in the early 20th century when he was studying the Finnish language and using that as a basis for the High Elven language of Quenya, is called the Kalevala. And the Kalevala was first published in 1835 by a scholar by the name of Elias Lönnrot. And the Kalevala really was not unlike what the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion are, right? Really a kind of synthetic mythology. Lönnrot went around Finland collecting stories and myths, and then wove them into a continuous narrative. Where many of these stories and many of these characters have actually in tradition not been connected to each other. So he doesn't go quite as far as Tolkien does in creating a kind of a whole new world for his mythology, but he does take existing elements, much as Tolkien does, and weaves them into a kind of national myth or kind of national epic for Finland. And one of the tales in the Kalevala is the story of a character by the name of Kullervo. So Kullervo is the last survivor of his clan, which has been killed off by his jealous uncle. The uncle raises Kullervo as a servant in his own household, but the boy is wayward and useless. The uncle can't turn him to anything useful, so he sells him into slavery to a smith named Ilmarinen. The only thing that Kullervo has to remind him of his past life is a knife that he was given by his mother. Ilmarinen, the smith's wife, is incredibly cruel to Kullervo, and when she sends him out to watch their cattle, she bakes him a piece of bread with stones baked into it. And when he tries to cut the bread with his heirloom knife, the blade breaks. In anger, he uses his magical powers, which are latent and tend to pop up at moments when he is upset. He uses his magical powers to kill the wife, and then goes off on his way, right? Eventually, he reconnects with his family, with the exception of his sister, who is missing and regarded as dead. He goes and kills his uncle's clan off to get vengeance for what they did to his family. And while he's on his way back, he meets with a girl whom he seduces, sleeps with, and impregnates. This girl later turns out to be his long-lost sister, who then commits suicide by jumping off of a cliff. Kullervo himself, who has asked the creator god Ukko for a magic sword, has a conversation with the sword in which he asks if it will drink his blood as readily as it will drink his enemies. And it says, like, I'm a sword, I don't care, right? I'll drink anybody's blood. Let's do this. And so Kullervo commits suicide by falling on his own sword. So we can see here a lot of the basic elements of the Hurin story, right? Tolkien has taken this basic pattern and this character and woven it together with these other influences, including his own wartime experiences, to create something different, right? Now, there's one more influence here that I do want to note, which I'd forgotten about as I was putting all this other stuff here. So, Nargothrond, the Noldoran hold that Hurin is defending, right, when he calls himself Mormigil, is accessed by a bridge, right, that Hurin insists on being built and refuses to have closed down. That is a detail taken from the Battle of Malden. Or that looks to me like it was probably taken from the Battle of Malden. Okay. So now that we've pulled all of this apart, let's get back into the text itself. Now, we talked last time about the role of disability. We started talking last time about the role of disability in the construction of character in this text, right? And I've given you a couple of poems written during the First World War that are all kind of concerned with the vulnerability of the soldier's body. So the first one by Siegfried Sassoon is called They, and it begins with a bishop exclaiming patriotic nonsense from the pulpit, right? All our young men will be transformed by service in this war, and then the injured men coming back explain to the bishop all the ways that they have been transformed, right? This one's gone crazy, this guy's lost a leg, this guy's got syphilis, right? So the ways they've been changed, yeah, they have been changed, right? They've been damaged by war. They've been destroyed by it. The Isaac Rosenberg poem demonstrates the vulnerability of soldiers even to these kinds of invisible pests, right? Trench fever was spread by lice, which is why they're so careful in this poem about trying to find all the lice and destroy them so that they don't get sick, right? The naked bodies of the soldiers are intended to demonstrate this vulnerability. And the last poem that I've given you there to look at by Wilfred Owen, Disabled, discusses, or it presents the reflections of a soldier who has come back unable to fight, unable even to walk, and his reflections upon his condition. So this notion of the vulnerable male body and what to do about the disabled soldier is a big animating principle in British life and British culture in the period immediately following the First World War, right? So around the same time that Tolkien is forming these narratives, right? Well, he's himself at home in hospital and then has to spend the remainder of the war in a home front unit with men who are either too sick or too old to go fight in Europe. So there's that sense of personal shame there, malingering. But this is all attached in various ways to war propaganda of the period. So I'm going to show you some propaganda posters that, in particular, look at the role of gender relations in the British government's construction of an idea of the war. And I wanted to try to apply this to Turin's relationships with Fingulus and Gwyndor, and then later on with Nienor and Brandir, right? So, women of Britain say go. What do we notice in this poster? What's going on here?
It's set in the countryside.
Okay, yeah, we've got the beautiful green rolling hills here, right?
You've got troops marching, and you've got women clinging to each other and a child clinging to the skirts.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and they're watching with both fear and pride as the men are marching off, right? Women of Britain say, go, right? The idea here being that the women of Britain want their menfolk to enlist, right? To go off and fight, to show this, this physical courage.
It's not just your government saying go fight, it's your women telling you to go fight too.
Exactly, right? Yeah, the idea here being, subtly here, right? That a soldier is more attractive, right? Here we've got, a woman on the home front, saving up the family rations, preventing waste, sacrificing to help her boy to victory, right? Now, this is an Irish propaganda poster. Irish, in 1916, an Irishman who's enlisting is not in a national Irish army, will be enlisting in the British army. And here, the Irish woman is trying to shame him into signing up, right? For the glory of Ireland, will you go or must I? Right, as he stands here hesitant, and various Irish, clearly sort of peasant-looking folk are watching Belgium burn. And my personal favorite, your mother telling you to go enlist, right?
Yeah.
Go. It's your duty, lad. Join today. So, what these have in common, right, is this idea that women want men to join the army, right? That women want men to go off and fight. That men are more attractive to women, that mothers are even more proud of their sons if their sons go off and fight, right? And I think that we can see this kind of discourse working its way into the children of Hurin. Let's go to the chapter in which Turin is in Nargothrond. I'm looking for,
Chapter 10.
yeah, I'm looking for the paragraph that physically describes Turin, or it tells us what he looks like.
That was on page 163.
Uh-huh.
Where's the bottom?
Okay. Yeah, so let's, yeah, can you read that starting at 163, starting with Gwyndor fell into dishonor?
Gwyndor fell into dishonor, for he was no longer fluid in arms, and his strength was small, and the pain of his maimed left arm was often upon him. But Turin was young and only now reached his full manhood, and he was in truth the son of Mor and Eldwin to look upon, tall, dark-haired, and pale-skinned, with gray eyes, and his face more beautiful than any other among mortal men in the elder days. His speech and bearing were those of the ancient kingdom of Doria, and even among the elves he might be taken at first meeting for one from the great houses of the Noldor. So valiant was Turin, and so exceedingly skilled in arms, especially with sword and shield, that the elves said that he could not be slain save by mischance or an evil arrow from afar. Therefore they gave him dwarf mail to guard him, and in grim mood he found in the armories a dwarf mask all gilded, and he put it on before battle, and his enemies fled before his face.
Okay. Keep going here, because, yeah, I think this next paragraph is important as well.
Now that he had had his way, and all went well, and he had work to do after his heart, and had honor in it, he was courteous to all, and less grim than of old, so that well nigh all hearts were turned to him, and many called him
Adamedhel.
the elf man. Most of all, Findulius, the daughter of Bordred, found her heart moved whenever he came near, or was in hall. She was golden-haired after the manner of the house of Finarfin. And Turin began to take pleasure in the sight of her and in her company, for she reminded him of his kindred in the women of Dorlund in his father's house.
Okay, thank you. So, what does this passage start with? What do we begin with here?
Gwyndor's dishonor.
Yeah, that Gwyndor is no longer respected, right? And why is Gwyndor no longer respected?
He can no longer fight.
Yeah, he can't fight anymore. And he's the one who keeps counseling caution, right? Yeah, Gwyndor isn't just unable to fight, he is physically disfigured, right? His experiences have left him looking old, which is unusual for an elf. They're supposed to be timeless. And he's missing a hand. And then what is this juxtaposed against? What do we get? after we're told about Gwyndor's maimed left arm and his small strength and his lack of physical courage now.
Hurin's young,
Yeah.
beautiful, strong.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Turin is strong and beautiful, right? And Gwyndor's Gwyndor's betrothed, right, the princess Finduilas, is now a lot more interested in young, strong Turin than she is in maimed Gwyndor, right? So Finduilas transfers her affections from Gwyndor to Turin. We're going to see a similar pattern in the Forest of Brethil with Brandir and Turin, right? Right, Brandir right, who was lame due to a childhood accident and also can't fight, nurses Nienor back to health, but she calls him brother, right? Wise brother, to which he responds, yeah, lame brother is what you're really thinking, right? Ugly brother is what you're really thinking. Yeah, she transfers her affection as well to Turin, because Turin is strong and bold and good looking. Never mind that he's also her brother, though she does not know this. So what this is referencing is this kind of dichotomy in British experience of the war on the home front. Right, on the one hand, military training was making young men more physically fit and better looking. And most people look good in a uniform, right? But those who have experienced war and come home, right, are often, like Gwyndor or Brandir, physically marked by the experience. Right? So you've got all these soldiers coming home from the war, particularly by the latter half of the war, 1917, 1918, when these poems were published and when Tolkien is writing these stories. And these physically fit, beautiful specimens of young British manhood are coming back shells of their former selves. They're coming back with missing limbs, missing eyes. They're coming back sick and weak, with weak lungs from inhaling mustard gas. They're coming back with even invisible disorders like trench fever or shell shock, what we now call PTSD. So Turin probably does also, I think Turin is in some ways a representation of a shell shock victim as well, right? So I think he also is disabled, but his disability isn't visible, right? There is that period when he goes catatonic after he accidentally kills Beleg. And he goes through periods of depression and insanity.
He says, to Nienor, I remember my darkness as well.
Uh-huh.
And I guess in him, he's thinking his darkness like his depression, whereas her darkness is she doesn't know anything about or remember anything about anyone.
And this is a side thing, but I kind of want to note, when she comes to when she first comes to Brethil, What does she look like when she arrives? If you look on page 213. But as for Nienor, she ran on into the wood, hearing the shouts of pursuit come behind, and her clothing she tore off, casting away her garments one by one as she fled, until she went naked. And all that day still she ran as a beast that is hunted to heart bursting, and dare not stay or draw breath. But at evening suddenly her madness passed. She stood still in a moment as in wonder, and then in a swoon of utter weariness, she fell as one stricken down into a deep brake of fern. And there amid the old bracken and the swift fronds of spring she lay and slept, heedless of all. Does this look familiar?
Saros' insult.
Yeah. Saros' insult about the women of Dorloman, right, or the women of the house of Hador, right? Do they run naked, do they run naked, covered only in their hair like the deer, right? Well, here, Nienor does exactly that, right? And, he called Turin a woodwose, right? He called him basically, a barbarian woodman.
That's more or less what he is.
Yeah, there's a point when he comes into Brethel where he essentially admits that identity, right? He calls it on page 194, right? I do but follow my trade, which is orc slaying, said Turin, and I dwell where my trade is. I am wild man of the woods. So it's almost as though he's taking on that identity assigned to him by this old enemy, right? And Nienor is behaving according to the patterns depicted by this old enemy, Saros, as well. So I think what we keep seeing here is Turin's past deeds coming back to haunt him in various ways, right? Sometimes they're subtle, as in this case. But yeah, his past keeps bubbling up and trying to harm him again. Now, to go back to the Nargothrond issue and Turin's behavior there, what's the name he adopts when he is in Nargothrond with the elves?
Murgil, the
Murmagil.
Black Sword.
Yeah, Mormagil, the Black Sword.
There you
So he identifies himself not just with his prowess as a fighter, but also with his weapon, right? Which he renames Iron of Death. And what's interesting here about Turin naming himself, or taking on the name of his weapon, or naming himself after his weapon? What has he already done with this weapon?
Killed his best friend.
Yeah, so in calling himself the Black Sword, right, he is also naming himself Friend Slayer. Because it's a reminder of his killing of Beleg, the sword's previous owner. Page 160 here, right? Because of his prowess and his skill in warfare with orcs, Turin found favor with Orodreth and was admitted to his council. Now Turin had no liking for the manner of fighting of the elves of Nargothrond, of ambush and stealth and secret arrow, and he urged that it be abandoned, and that they should use their strength to attack the servants of the enemy to open battle in pursuit. But Gwyndor spoke ever against Turin in this matter in the council of the king, saying that he had been in Angband and had a glimpse of the power of Morgoth, and had some inkling of his designs. Petty victories will prove profitless at the last, he said. For thus Morgoth learns where the boldest of his enemies are to be found, and gathers strength great enough to destroy them. All the might of the elves and Edain united sufficed only to contain him, and to gain the peace of a siege. Long indeed, but only so long as Morgoth bided his time before he broke the leaguer. And never again can such a union be made. Only in secrecy lies hope of survival, until the valor come. So Gwyndor is another one of these figures who counsels restraint, right? That releasing too much of our strength too soon in the end proves profitless, even if we win a few small victories, right? But this attitude doesn't win the girls, right? Nor does it win favor in the councils, even in this case of an elf king. So even among other elves, Gwyndor loses face, loses respect, loses Finwë. Just as Brandir in Brethil, right, is expected. Well, there's a point at which he sits in his high seat, right? If we look on page 227, he's supposed to be the lord of the people of Brethil, right? But no others were so swift to the call, for the dread of Glorm lay on them, and the scouts that had seen him had gone about and grown in the telling. Then Dorlus cried out, "Hearken, men of Brethil, it is now well seen that for the evil of our times the counsels of Brandir were vain. There is no escape by hiding. Will none of you take the place of the son of Handir, that the house of Haleth be not put to shame?" Thus Brandir, who sat indeed in the high seat of the Lord of the assembly, but unheeded, was scorned, and he was bitter in his heart. For Turambar did not rebuke Dorlus. But when Hunthor, Brandor's kinsman, arose and said, "You do evilly, Dorlus, to speak thus to the shame of your lord, whose limbs by ill hazard cannot do as his heart would. Beware lest the contrary be seen in you at some turn. And how can it be said that his counsels were vain when they were never taken? You, his liege, have ever set them at naught. I say to you that Glorm comes to us now, as to Nargothrond before, because our deeds have betrayed us as he feared. But since this woe is now come, with your leave, son of Handir, I will go on behalf of Haleth's house." So Brandir is supposed to rule here, but is disrespected by his own people, right? Brandir has always been a civilian due to this childhood injury. And indeed, the first time he ever kills somebody, right, he kills Dorlus, and he's disgusted by the action. And then this ends up being the only time he ever kills anyone, because Turin turns around and kills him. But I think, this notion, right, that how can it be said that his counsels were vain when they were never taken? I think that, there's something to that in the way Turin's counsels always lead, and Turin's actions always lead to destruction, right? He insists on building that bridge in Nargothrond and going out and challenging the orcs. And that brings Glorm the dragon and his armies right to them. He starts fighting the orcs in the forest of Brethil. Glorm hears about the black sword coming back out, and thus comes to Brethil. And there's also this incident when he does return home to Dorloman, because he thinks he'll find his mother and his sister there. What happens when he comes home for the first time since he's been a child. How has his home changed?
The Easterlings have taken over. All the people that were like among him are now just serfs and slaves.
And
Yeah.
those who speak the old tongue are seen as spies.
Yep, the Yvain are enslaved, his people.
And his aunt is forced into marriage
Yep,
by Rhoda.
yes, his aunt has been forced to marry Broda. But she uses her position, right? Erin uses her position to try to help the other Edain where she can, right?
Sodor says,
Uh-huh.
cautions him not to speak ill against his aunt, for she has taken great pains to help, even at
Yeah.
the cost of her own comfort.
Uh-huh. And when Turin busts into the hall demanding information and kills Brada, his aunt rebukes him, right? Page 189. She says, "He speaks with truth of death," said Erin. "You have learned what you would. Now go swiftly, but go first to Morwen and comfort her, or I will hold all the wrath you have wrought here hard to forgive. For ill though my life was, you have brought death to me with your violence. The incomers will avenge this night on all that were here. Rash are your deeds, son of Hurin, as if you were still but the child that I knew. And faint heart is yours, Erin, Indor's daughter, as it was when I called you aunt, and a rough dog frightened you," said Turin. "You were made for a kinder world. But come away, I will bring you to Morwen." So, his words to her are pretty vicious here, right? And really undeserved. He's essentially accusing her of cowardice for not standing up and fighting back, right? But she's in a position where she can't fight back, right? The only people she might, the only people around she might rally are, are old and injured, like people like Sador, right? Who also can't fight. And these people, Turin basically leads into the hills and abandons, right? Right? "The snow lies on the land, but deeper upon my head," she answered. "I should die as soon in the wild with you as of the brood Easterlings. You cannot mend what you have done." Right? Another reminder that time only moves in one direction. "Go. To stay will make all the worse and rob Morwen to no purpose. Go, I beg you." And then she sets fire to the hall, right? And burns herself in it. "They have fired the hall," said Turin. "To what purpose is that?" "They? No, Lord, she, I guess," said one, Asgon by name. "Many a man of arms misreads patience and quiet. She did much good among us at much cost. Her heart was not faint, and patience will break at the last." Now some of the hardiest that could endure the winter stayed with Turin and led him by strange paths to a refuge in the mountains, a cave known to outlaws and renegades, and some store of food was hidden there. There they waited until the snow ceased, and they gave him food and took him to a pass little used that led south to Sirian's Vale, where the snow had not come. On the downward path they parted. "Farewell now, Lord of Dorloman," said Asgon, "but do not forget us. We shall be hunted now, and the wolf folk will be crueler because of your coming. Therefore go, and do not return, unless you come with strength to deliver us. Farewell." So, Turin's rashness pretty much leads everyone who trusts him to disaster, right? And eventually leads him to his own death. Right, we have this scene that is very reminiscent of Kullervo on page 256. Right. Then he drew forth his sword and said, Hail, Girthang, iron of death, you alone now remain. But what lord or loyalty do you know, save the hand that wields you? From no blood will you shrink. Will you take Turin Turambar? Will you slay me swiftly? And from the blade rang a cold voice in answer. Yes, I will drink your blood, that I may forget the blood of Beleg my master, and the blood of Brandir slain unjustly. I will slay you swiftly. So what's going on? Like, what is he reminded of here then in his final moments before he throws himself onto the sword?
That he's
Beleg
killed his best friend.
Yeah, he killed his best friend.
And that he killed a man unjustly.
Yeah, that he killed Brandir, who didn't deserve it and wasn't his physical equal, right? Wasn't capable of fighting back. So yeah, it's a reminder that Turin's actions in life have been ill-considered and unjust, however strong and good-looking he is. And the last thing that I want to talk about here, and then I'll let everybody go, is the way this ends. So there's this final scene kind of tacked onto it after Turin is buried, and the people of Brethil put up his memorial. That brings us full circle back to the beginning. Right. Hurin is finally released from his curse. Morgoth lets him go because what harm can he do now? And he finds Morwen at the grave of their children. All right, page 258. You come at last, she said. I have waited too long. It was a dark road. I have come as I could, he answered. But you are late, she said. Too late. They are lost. I know, he said, but you are not. Almost, she said. I am spent utterly. I shall go with the sun. They are lost. She clutched at his cloak. Little time is left, she said. If you know, tell me, how did she find him? But Hurin did not answer, and he sat beside the stone with Morwen in his arms, and they did not speak again. The sun went down, and Morwen sighed and clasped his hand and was still, and Hurin knew that she had died. What do you make of this? I mean, apart from the fact that this is, wrenchingly sad.
Well, before this, the last time they were together, they were in a meadow talking about their two children. And
Yeah.
now it ends with them in a meadow talking about two of their children.
Yeah. Only, they've outlived those children, right? And how is Hurin different? What do we know? What does even Morwen seem to realize Hurin must know?
How they found each other.
Yeah, he must have seen it, right? Because Morgoth forced him to watch. But he doesn't tell her. He doesn't answer. He holds his tongue. Now, I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but I think that some of this is to form a contrast to the earlier, hastier Hurin and the rash deeds and rash actions of his son, right? Perhaps, someone who has learned perspective through his torments and decides not to do more harm by speaking than he would by remaining silent. So, go ahead.
Better to think your children just found each other and died together than to find out that not only did they find each other, but, they got married.
Yeah.
They're on the way to having a child together.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of I think that some of what's happening here is that what the novel is doing is going to try to bring you around to kind of respect for that long view, right? That patience and restraint are not necessarily weakness. Because it seems to pretty consistently side with those characters who counsel restraint in some way, right? There's a great deal of sympathy here for these disabled characters who aren't listened to. And last thing I want to say, because I think this relates to that whole theme, is that the thing that pisses Turin off when Findulus offers it to him, right? Her pity. When she pities him, it makes him angry. Why is that? Why would pity make him angry? What does pity indicate?
Weakness.
Yeah, you pity something you perceive as weak. And in order to not be perceived as weak, he's burned down everything around him. Okay, so given that we started early, we're about out of time, so I'm going to give you the guide questions for next time. I will do the cleanup today. And we'll see you on Monday.